happy to really meet you, at least virtually. Hopefully someday we'll be back in the saddle and regular in-person talks. So the title of my talk is In Search of Wealth and Health. And one of the things I miss about not having an audience in front of me, I usually ask everyone how many are Colorado natives, how many are newcomers, but we'll assume there's a mix of both in here. So the first thing I want to point out is that 2009 marked the 150th anniversary of the city of Denver, and it also marked the 150th anniversary of the Denver Jewish community. So while that is not unique, it's very unusual. There's a similar situation in San Francisco, and it really made all the difference because Jews were present at creation, so to speak, here in Colorado. So I don't want to give you the impression there was no anti-Semitism, but despite some instances of discrimination, members of the Colorado Jewish community really moved easily in the early frontier society. It was highly pluralistic, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and it made it relatively easy for pioneer Jews to integrate in Western cities more so than on the East Coast. For example, Colorado had a Jewish mayor in every city, virtually every city before the turn of the century, in the late 1890s, early 1910s, and that included a Jewish mayor in Denver, Wolf Londoner, I'm trying to see if I have the date, 1889, a Jewish mayor in Central City, in Fairplay, Colorado, any real Central City, I told you, any city you can think of, even tiny small ones, Georgetown. That was really pretty normal around the American West, probably over 50 Jewish mayors in small towns all over the American West. And a Jewish mayor in Denver in 1889, you're talking about nearly a century before there's a Jewish mayor in New York City with of course, a much larger Jewish population. The same thing, there was a Jewish senator from Colorado, Senator Guggenheim, in about, I think it was about 1907 to 1912. Again, many decades before Jewish senators, US senators on the East Coast, including New York. So again, I don't want to say there was no anti-Semitism, but in the early years, the pioneer years in Denver and Colorado, people were really building community. They were more concerned about what people could contribute to building community than what their origins were. And the need for capable leaders in the early pioneer towns in Colorado really provided an entree for Jews in political, economic, social, cultural, philanthropic, and religious life, where they really made pivotal contributions. Another advantage for Jews in Colorado is that they were perceived as white in contrast to African Americans, Chinese, Hispanic people. So they were really accepted as white. And some of those early Jews, I should say, in 1859, about a dozen Jews of basically German Jewish descent came into Denver, and they really helped found the community. We have, for instance, the first mercantile store in Colorado was founded by the Salomon brothers that very first year in 1859. The eldest brother came into Denver with about $30,000 worth of goods, which was a considerable amount at the time. And one of the other early pioneers was Dr. John Elsner. Dr. Elsner was a German Jew. He became a very prominent physician here in Denver, and he really founded the first hospital here. He put it together in a barn with about 30 patients, and that was the origin of Denver Health today. So Jews made major contributions. Those of you who have lived here might recall some other famous names here. For instance, the Schwader family, those are Eastern European Jews we're going to talk about later, but they founded the Samsonite Luggage Company, which of course had international ramifications. So those first German Jews, no one was a miner, and there were very few Jews who came into mining here. We like to say that those early Jews mined the miners, and that was that they basically supplied merchandise to them, even mining equipment. Leadville, Colorado was a major community at the time because of the silver boom, and Jews dominated the storefronts in those days. On the main street in Leadville, there were probably at least 30 stores owned by Jews, including David May. Again, if any of you have lived here for a while, you're familiar with the May Company. And David May came to Colorado because he had asthma. As a young man, he opened a store in Irwin, Colorado, then Leadville, then Denver. And of course, we know that the May Company eventually merged what's today Macy's, but during its heyday, it was the second largest national department store chain in the country. Also, Leopold Goldman opened a store in Leadville. He founded in Denver the Golden Eagle, Goldman's Golden Eagle store. That was the first popular price department store in Colorado. So Jews really came to the fore in certainly in the economic realm, but also in politics. We have, as I mentioned to you, Jews as mayors, even as US senators, certainly on city councils. And at the very first Moonlight meeting that united the towns of Auraria and Denver into Denver City, Abraham Jacobs, who was a merchant, and we'll talk about his wife later, who was more important than he was. Abraham Jacobs was the secretary for that Moonlight meeting that actually united Auraria and Denver into one city. Again, Jews were here from 1859, and I have to tell you that the Jewish community really sprung up that very first year. With 12 men. They didn't have a synagogue yet, but they didn't need one. They had a minyan. They met in a storefront, I believe. But they had a Rosh Hashanah service the very first year in 1859. And to tell you a little bit about how Jews were perceived or welcomed, I'm going to read you a little excerpt from the Rocky Mountain News in 1865. So it says, yesterday, but even, as I said, they came in 1859, and by 1865, Jews were still somewhat of a mystery. Most of the people here hadn't really met Jews before. So the Rocky Mountain News said then, yesterday was the Jewish year 5226, a gala day for them. This will account for the closing of their houses yesterday. The day before, the newspaper wrote and said, we think this is some kind of holiday for the Jews. We don't know what it is. And the next day, again, that was they amended that. And they said that it was Rosh Hashanah. And then they said, we hope our readers will understand no disrespect was meant to our Israelite friends in the local column last evening. So Jews were generally called Israelites at the time. But you can see that they were very apologetic, and they really wanted to unify the community. There was a small Jewish community of 500 by 1897, and most of them were German Jews. And I'm going to pause for a minute and give you a very little quick overview of American Jewish history so you can see how Denver and Colorado fits in. The first Jews really came to the United States in 1654. It was a group of Sephardic Jews, that's Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal, who were fleeing the long arm of the Inquisition. Many of those Jews had left Spain, and they had made their way to Recife, Brazil, which at the time was a Dutch colony. It was reconquered by the Portuguese, and the Jews pretty much had to flee. So they left quickly. They had hoped to go back to Europe. They couldn't make it there. Then they hoped to shelter in Cuba. They couldn't get there. And they made their way up to the coast. They sold everything to the captain of the ship to try to get them there. And they landed in what was then called New Amsterdam. If you're from the East Coast, you know New Amsterdam was New York City. And they were not welcomed there by the governor of the colony, Peter Stuyvesant. It was a Dutch mercantile colony. The point was to make money. Stuyvesant didn't like Jews, and he didn't like Catholics, and he didn't like Protestants, any that were other than his Calvinist background. But he was forced to allow those Jews to enter the colony because back in the Netherlands, the Dutch East India Company, which ran the colony, had some Jews on the board of directors, and they used their influence to pressure the board, and with the caveat that the Jews could remain in what later became New York if they cared for their own, that they wouldn't be any burden charitably, and they were not allowed to have a synagogue, which wasn't a terrible challenge at the time. They just had private services in a house. They weren't allowed to stand guard. They didn't have full rights. And really, one of the members of that early group, Asher Levy, actually protested. He really worked very hard to get those rights. Eventually, they were granted. And it's probably the first instance in the Americas where an ethnic group uses its powers of persuasion to allow for greater civil rights, not just for Jews, but for other ethnic and religious groups at the time. So those first Jews in America, and they spread out up and down the coast. That's what we had at the time. Of course, America didn't go farther west. Those first Jews were largely Sephardic Jews. Later in the 1820s and 30s, we start to get an influx of Jews from German-speaking countries. This really picks up in the 1840s and 50s. And those German Jews have had very restrictive lives in their countries, in the German-speaking states. They are restricted as to what professions or business they could go into, where they live, and even who and when and if they could marry. So a lot of the young German Jewish men are trying to make their way to what is now the United States, where they hope for greater integration and more freedom and opportunity. And as I said, it really picks up in the 1850s after the revolutions fail in Europe in 1848, where people had been hoping that Jews would be better accepted, and those revolutions all failed. We have many young German Jews coming to the United States, and that's where we start the story in Colorado, because a lot of them have gone west. They have come, like other men and women from other ethnic and religious groups out west in Colorado in particular, for not only economic opportunity, but also religious freedom, and in some cases simply for adventure. And that's where this early German Jewish community in Denver originates. So, I say flippantly, in search of wealth. It's a combination of many factors, but it is largely the opportunity to make something of themselves. Many of them start out as peddlers. As they become more successful, many open small shops, and there are a number of names I'm sure you're familiar with around the United States, German Jews who become major department store and business owners, including in that group. Macy's in New York, Abraham and Strauss, I'm trying to think, Bonwit Teller, Sears Roebuck, Julius Rosenwald, son of German Jewish immigrants, Hart Schaffner and Marx, the men's company started by 3 German single Jews, Filene's in Boston, so many Gimbels, so many companies, Altman's, so many major companies that are started by young German Jewish immigrants. And some of them are not only enormously successful, but are really cutting edge. Sears Roebuck, which is Julius Rosenwald, introduces the first catalogs in the United States. So we have it on a smaller scale here in Colorado. So the point is that by 1897, there are about 500 Jews here, mostly, not all, mostly of German Jewish descent, some Eastern Europeans, not a lot yet. And they have founded a synagogue in 1874, Congregation Emmanuel. The very first thing they found when they come to Denver in 1872 is a burial society. And very soon we have Jewish men's and women's relief charitable organizations. And in the 1890s, things changed rapidly in Colorado in terms of the Jewish community. And that's why the second half of my title, it's In Search of Wealth and Health. What changes the Jewish community and why it grows so significantly, because Kansas City, for example, started out by 1900 about the same size as Denver, but Denver's Jewish community mushrooms because by the 1880s, Colorado has earned a reputation as the world sanatorium. By the late 19th century, tuberculosis is the leading cause of death in the illness in the United States and in the world. And there is no magic bullet at that time. They don't even understand germ theory until really the late 1890s, and people aren't accepting that even then. And at that time, most physicians recommend that people with tuberculosis or consumption, as it was also called, move out west, particularly to Colorado. And so there is a huge influx. According to one report by the Denver Chamber of Commerce, by 1925, as much as 60% of Denver's general population comes here because of TB. And that's certainly reflected in the Jewish community as well. So remember, I spoke to you briefly before about Abraham Jacobs, who was a businessman and fairly successful for a time. Eventually, he went bankrupt. And I should say his brother-in-law, Benjamin Weisbart, actually was a successful businessman as well and became the mayor of Central City. Abraham Jacobs in the 1860s wed Weisbart's sister, Frances Weisbart Jacobs. And she came out to Colorado in the 1860s as a young bride, first lived in Central City, then they moved to Denver. And they had 3 children. They lost one child at a young age, and his wife, Frances, they were upper middle class, really rubbed elbows with the rich and famous here in Colorado. She served on the Denver Women's Relief Society along with Elizabeth Byers, the wife of the editor of the Rocky Mountain News, and Mrs. Evans. So she was really well accepted in society. And after the death of her son, I think she was really looking for a way to not just occupy herself, but to give back to the community. And she became immersed in charitable philanthropy. She especially was concerned about the plight of people with tuberculosis. And she was really kind of a one-woman show. She lobbied the politicians in town to try to get a hospital or a sanatorium established for tuberculosis patients. The town fathers didn't want to do that because they were afraid it would tarnish Colorado's reputation as a health resort. The railroads and other boosters in Colorado really wanted people to come to Colorado, even those with TB. They didn't realize in the beginning how contagious it was or that it was contagious at all. They wanted bodies here. They wanted the money that these tuberculars could bring with them. As a matter of fact, one Denver booster wrote, "The air is so healthy in Colorado that a man has to be shot to die here." So those kind of exaggerated claims really attracted people who were really came to Colorado as a last resort. And I don't mean that as a pun, but most of them by the time they got here had their funds reduced. And this was no more evident than with the Jewish community. So you remember that I told you first Sephardic Jews, then German Jews. German Jews by the 1880s, not everyone, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but most of the German Jews had integrated very well in American society, had become at least moderately economically successful, were middle or upper middle class, some very wealthy. And they were kind of proud of their position. They were really trying to raise their socio and economic level. And they had followed many customs of their Protestant middle class contemporaries, even in synagogues. Early Temple Emmanuel and Reformed congregations all around the country started adopting a lot of customs that they pulled in from Protestant churches, mixed pews, family pews. Before then, there was separate seating, those types of things. Rabbi Friedman, the most prominent rabbi probably historically at Temple Emmanuel, wore kind of a clerical collar, the same way Protestant ministers did. And so they were very proud and fearful of losing their positions. And then we start to get in the 1880s. And again, in the United States, by 1880, there were about 250,000 Jews in the United States, mostly German Jews. In 1880, we get a huge flood of Eastern European immigrants fleeing Russia, Eastern Europe, a lot of them for their lives because of pogroms, but most of them come really because of the terrible grinding poverty. They're so restricted as to what businesses they can go in and hardly any professions or higher education. So there's a huge influx, and those 250,000 are joined by about 2.25 million Eastern European Jews. And so that's a tremendous challenge for the German Jewish community. So to their credit, they gave very significantly of their time and money to assist those Jews, to acculturate them, to Americanize them. And those are some of the key words, because they really felt a responsibility and they accepted them as their brethren, but they also often looked down upon them as kind of inferior Jews, because many of them spoke Yiddish, which they thought of as an inferior type of German. They dressed differently. Many of them spoke Yiddish, as I said, and certainly not every Eastern European Jew was observant or Orthodox, but many of them were different from the German Reformed Jews. And maybe most offensively, there were a good number of radical socialists in the group as well. And all of that felt very threatening to their pretty middle class and upper middle class position. And that's going to play out here in Denver as well. So we have 500 Jews, and we have a huge influx of Eastern European Jews, many of them who have worked in the sweatshops in New York and other urban centers, who contract TB. Now, most people don't realize tuberculosis can attack any part of your body, but the one we're most familiar with is pulmonary tuberculosis, tuberculosis of the lungs. And Jews actually had a lower incidence of TB than other religious and ethnic groups, but because so many of them were working in the garment industry, where they were in very closed quarters, poor ventilation, long hours, poor nutrition, and lived in slum kind of apartments, tenement houses, there were a lot of Jews, and it was nicknamed the tailor's disease. And of course, many, many Jews were, if we wouldn't call them tailors, they were certainly garment workers. So they start to flock to Colorado. Francis Jacobs is really the impetus behind the founding of National Jewish Hospital for Consumptives, today National Jewish Health. And she worked very hard. She unfortunately died from pneumonia before the hospital could open, but she was able to persuade the Jewish community to come forward. And National Jewish Hospital was actually named the Francis Jacobs Hospital in the first years. It didn't open right away because of a terrible depression across the Panic of 1893 across the United States. But eventually it opened in 1899 with the assistance of B'nai B'rith, a German philanthropic fraternal organization. They taxed all their members, I think, a penny or two across the United States, and it was enough to help the organization open. So National Jewish Hospital was really a magnificent institution. It was the first sanatorium in Denver and started and funded by the Jewish community. It was formally non-sectarian, but I would say until the 1930s, probably 92% of the patients were Eastern European Jewish immigrants. And it was free of charge. Its motto was none may enter who pay, none may pay who enter. So it did a lot of wonderful work. It was cutting edge for the time, but it was also a very German institution in many ways. And it also reflected the progressive era of the time, where all institutions, even hospitals, were urged to run like businesses. And so National Jewish did wonderful work. It also had a number of important rules that we're going to talk about. One is because it was a part of the progressive era philosophy, it only allowed people in the incipient section of TB, what shall I say, development of TB, to come in. And that was because they felt that those were the people they could help cure, perhaps, or at least treat successfully. And they wanted to get the most bang for their buck. They only allowed people there for 6 months at the most, because they felt if they couldn't help them in 6 months, then their money was wasted. They also worked very hard to try to Americanize those Jews. They had classes for them in English and training. And they also often, to the Eastern European Jews, particularly those who were traditional, felt that the German Jews were very condescending to them and disrespectful of their religious traditions. For example, the first superintendent at National Jewish Hospital insisted that meat and milk had to be served together at all meals to strengthen the patients. And of course, that was anathema to many of the patients. So people appreciated the work, they appreciated the treatment. And I should tell you, at the time, there was no medicine, there was no magic bullet for TB. And most of these sanatoriums emphasized fresh air. So you have pictures of patients out on the National Jewish Hospital verandas in the coldest air, sleeping outside. A lot of food, tremendous amounts of milk, eggs, and meat. This is not unusual. When I did my doctoral dissertation on TB in Colorado, I read a memoir of a woman who is at a Nordrick Sanatorium, which is near Colorado Springs. Part of her diet every day was 26 raw eggs a day. National Jewish was not as extreme, but pretty much I've looked at menus. The diet usually included about 5 or 6 raw eggs. They felt that would help. TB was considered a wasting disease. People got thinner and thinner and lost their energy. So part of their treatment was to fatten them up. So those were considered high protein fattening foods. So before long, we have an alternative institution that comes up kind of in a reaction to National Jewish, and that is the Jewish Consumptives Relief Society, the JCRS. And I don't think it's a total accident. National Jewish opened, the buildings were on the very east end of Colfax Avenue at the end of the streetcar line. The Jewish Consumptives Relief Society, the JCRS, was located at the very west of Colfax because they were, and there was a lot of antagonism between the two hospitals in the early years. The JCRS was founded by a group of 20 Eastern European immigrants, some of them who had TB, basically poor working men. They wanted an environment that they felt would cater more to the needs of more traditional Eastern European Jews. And they were able to enlist a couple of prominent Jewish doctors here, Dr. Philip Hilkowitz, who is a leading pathologist here, and probably more importantly, Dr. Charles Spivak, who himself was a Russian Jewish immigrant. He was a gastroenterologist. He came to the United States when he was around 20, tried a couple of jobs. He had to leave Russia quickly. He was a radical socialist. He kind of had to flee for his life. He tried a couple of jobs. He didn't have training, didn't have the English language at the beginning, and he became a mill worker in Maine, where I wrote a biography of Dr. Spivak, if you have any interest. In Maine, as I said, he worked the night shift in a mill factory, and the townspeople were very lovely, and a lot of the Eastern European Jews got together to kind of educate themselves. And one of them said to Dr. Spivak, whose name then was Chaim Spivakovsky, became Dr. Charles Spivak, eventually in the United States, said, Charles, if you want to get ahead, you have to learn to speak United States. So he learned to speak United States very beautifully. He went to medical school in Philadelphia, received his degree from Jefferson College, was very successful in Philadelphia, and came out in 1896 to Colorado because his wife had incipient TB. So even though he had socialist origins, he eventually became very supportive of his fellow Eastern European Jews. He had a great respect for Yiddish. He actually co-authored a famous English Yiddish dictionary with a prominent Jewish poet. And he worked very hard to he understood, even though he wasn't, in the early years for certain, wasn't a very observant Jew, he saw the connection between people feeling comfortable in their environment and healing. And so he worked, something we know about today, of course. He worked very hard to honor those traditions. So I also should mention National Jewish Hospital did not have a kosher kitchen until 1923, almost 25 years after it started. The JCRS had a kosher kitchen from the beginning. It encouraged Yiddish culture. Both hospitals tried to Americanize the patients. They celebrated Jewish holidays at JCRS, but also American holidays, Thanksgiving, 4th of July, very, very popular. And because of Spivak's socialist leanings, two major differences between National Jewish Hospital. He insisted that patients be admitted in all stages of the disease, even those who were extreme and would be dying within a few days, because he felt those were the most in need of help. And he also insisted that it would be a people's institution, that they would raise their money, and I'm quoting him exactly in quarters and dollars instead of the large amounts that usually went to National Jewish Hospital. And they were both successful. JCRS really attracted support from working men circles all over the United States, and they had women's auxiliaries all over. And they had basically the same treatment, the food, the fresh air, the rest. There were some early surgeries where they collapsed one lung at both hospitals. By the 1940s, they had discovered, not here, but in the United States, kind of what I call a TB cocktail, a combination of antibiotics and other drugs that were effective against TB. And so both National Jewish continued, it had a little flirtation with heart treatment, but as a National Jewish continued as a Center for Respiratory Treatment and Immunology. The JCRS turned to cancer treatment and eventually merged with University of Colorado Health Sciences. So there it is no more. But the Jewish population grew exponentially because many of the people who came out to the hospital stayed here and brought their relatives. So we had, whether they came in search of wealth, health, or a combination of both, Jewish immigration to Denver, Jewish immigrants joined with other religious and ethnic groups to help really shape the contours of our city and state for well over 150 years. So I'm going to leave you a little time for questions. Some of you may have had your own experiences, so I'll let you go ahead, Rebecca, and ask if there are any questions.
Okay. I have a question. Would you verify a story that a Jewish merchant was lynched because he kept his business open on Christmas. Is that a fact?
Yes. There was a doctoral dissertation written a couple years ago. I think I know the fellow well. He did research in the Beck archives, and he's a good historian. He talks about 3 or 4. As remember, I told you certainly was not without anti-Semitism, but there were 2 or 3 deaths, and of course they were horrendous, and of course terrible tragedies to the family and the community. But when you think about what life was like in Europe and other places, it was very muted. So I'm not saying it wasn't there, and it's unfortunate. It was really, I would say, like kind of a gang of hoodlums that killed that man. And it was an excuse. I don't know that it had anything to do with being on Christmas or anything else. But thankfully, that was a small number. It was very muted compared to other parts of the country.
Will you speak about Frances Weipart Jacobs and what is now the United Way?
Yes. Okay. So Frances her nickname was the Mother of Denver Charities, not the Mother of Denver Jewish Charities, but the Mother of Denver Charities. So Frances, as I told you, made philanthropy her life work for a number of reasons we won't go into here. But she founded the first free kindergarten here in Denver. That was like a daycare center for children whose mothers were poor and had to work. And she also founded, with a Catholic priest and a Protestant minister, the Denver Charity Organization. And that eventually merged into the United Way of, evolved into the United Way of America. And she's acknowledged as one of those founders. So she had not just a local influence, but a national and even international influence.
Isn't she also one of the only women that has a glass window in the Capitol?
She's the only woman, the only Jewish only woman, the only Jew in the Gallery of Pioneers. The other Jew who was important to is Otto Mears. That's a whole other story. But a Russian Jewish immigrant whose nickname was the Pathfinder helped carve out roads on the western slope. And he's got a glass window, but not in the Pioneer section. He's the one who persuaded the, I guess, board for the state capitol building to gold leaf the dome.
Well, I will say one thing that you had mentioned, which was new to me, is I always attributed TB to the lungs only. I never knew that TB could take over the whole body.
Yeah, you could have tuberculosis of the liver, the bones, the brain, but the one we know most commonly is of the lungs.
Dr. Abrams, I know that there was an exhibit with History Colorado that I know you were a part of. Can you talk a little bit about the impetus to do that exhibit? I don't know if it's still ongoing and kind of the role you played there.
Yeah, thank you. The History Colorado came to us about 2 years ago. They opened the new Ballantyne, I think it's called the Community Gallery. And the purpose of it is to showcase something from a different ethnic and religious group every XYZ time. I don't know how long it is. We were supposed to be in there for 6 months. They came to us first because of the subject. I'll tell you what we picked for the subject. They came to us because they knew we had a really robust, developed archives, which they could use the materials from. So I did choose the materials and write the copy for everything that went into it. It was supposed to be open for 6 months. It had to close early because of COVID. And the theme was, I believe it was called A Legacy of Healing, the pivotal role the Colorado Jews played in medicine in Colorado. So it talked about the JCRS, National Jewish, Rose, Beth Israel, Shalom Park, the Denver Jewish Sheltering Home for Jewish Children. What I am very proud of, I think it was an outstanding, they had a wonderful gala opening with hundreds of people. Before it closed prematurely, they had 6,000 people who went through the exhibit. So that was pretty exciting, a pretty nice footprint for the Beck Archives.
I have one, Jeanne, history is not my best subject, but has Denver developed in the West? How do we compare with like some of the other cities that were, you know, we know kind of the roots of how Denver developed, but what else was going on in the West? Like, how do we compare to some of the other Western states and cities around us as far as like Jewish development and presence and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what marks Colorado as being so different in Denver, what makes it so prominent is the health issue and people coming out here for TB treatments. So that made us very famous. Everybody knew, you know, National Jewish and the JCRS. I remember when I went to visit my mother in Florida, and we're talking, gosh, maybe at least 40 years ago. I found when I went to the grocery store there in Jewish stores, there were little charity boxes for National Jewish and the JCRS out on the counters. So, you know, that was like a national imprint. It's similar in a sense to San Francisco, as I mentioned. Jews came out there with the gold rush, so they were very prominent in politics. They don't have the same health factor, but San Francisco in its heyday had a larger per capita Jewish population than New York City. So it's similar to there. Jews were in the forefront in most Western cities. And again, as I said, what makes them exceptionally in the forefront in Colorado is the health factor.
You know, Jeanne, we had a program on Jews of the Santa Fe Trail with Naomi Sandweiss, and I'm wondering what the influence of the Santa Fe Trail as well coming through with the Jews who became very prominent merchants and things.
Right. Abraham Jacobs had a connection. We certainly know New Mexico was another important Jewish community in its heyday as well. And yes, many of them came through that way, various other ways. But like I said, again and again, I don't want to overemphasize, but it's the crux of it. The health trail was probably the most important.